The Reich Eagle, swastika flags, and goose-stepping parades. This is 1940. This footage was filmed in Paris, France, by soldiers of the German army, the Wehrmacht. During the war years, this was their home. More than 100,000 German soldiers, officers, and generals, both men and women, passed through the City of Light. For all of them, Paris was a dream posting.
Paris was the golden years. Perfume, good food, and all those monuments to visit.
Far from the battlefields, the new masters turned Paris into an El Dorado, where everything was designed for them.
The Germans could choose the most pleasant, delightful spots. Obviously, they wouldn't choose to live in some grim-looking building.
The chic neighborhoods became a second Germany. Clubs, cafes, and cinemas, where the entire German offering was reserved for the soldiers.
It was very important that they lived as Germans.
The soldiers were free to enjoy themselves. At night, cabarets, theaters, restaurants, as well as French prostitutes were at their disposal.
It allowed me to take advantage of things I'd never had at home. By that I mean the brothels.
On the downside, the German occupation caused shortages, rationing for the Parisians, as well as roundups and fierce repression.
It was scary. You felt the grip of occupation.
Though in total opposition, French and Germans came together. Some even went from hostility to love. And relationships like that of Marguerite and Otto even produced a child.
My father loved my mother, and my mother loved my father, madly.
These soldiers recount their own Parisian adventures. First, Klaus, a soldier from the Luftwaffe, or German Air Force, and telephone operator Gertrude. Then there are the children of soldiers who heard their stories and archived photos and documents. Today, Peter Lorenz, son of a senior officer, and Margaret Vita, daughter of a regular soldier, are the guardians of their father's memories.
He was fascinated with life in this metropolis.
But there are also thousands of diaries, countless photo albums, not to mention the millions of letters sent home to families during the war years. So many singular stories, authentic testimonies of the 4 years when Paris was German. Who were these soldiers and officers? How did they enjoy life in the world's most beautiful city? And what were the real relationships between the new masters and the vanquished Parisians? For the first time, the occupation of Paris is told from an opposite viewpoint, that of the German soldiers. June 14th, 1940. The weather in Paris is bright, but the capital is like a ghost town. The buildings, cafe terraces, and streets are empty. More than 1 million of the 1.8 million Parisians have already fled. And for good reason. Their worst nightmare was coming true. The German army, Wehrmacht, was marching on the capital. Hitler's Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, had defeated France in just 5 weeks of fierce fighting, in which 80,000 soldiers met their deaths. Just a few miles from Paris, the victorious troops made one final halt. 18-year-old soldier Werner from Lower Saxony recalls.
Before entering the city, we had to clean our vehicles and our uniforms and look like soldiers who were neat and tidy. We had to make a good impression.
The first units arrived from the north, entering the city through the Porte de Clignancourt and the Porte de la Villette.
The first units to arrive in Paris that morning, around 6 o'clock in the morning, were motorcycle units. They headed for the Place de la Concorde, which in fact became the home of the High German Command. The Germans met with no resistance in Paris.
Paris, City of Light, fell into the hands of the Reich, a fine prize and the high point of a victorious campaign. At the time, Klaus was a 19-year-old soldier, and he knew how lucky he was.
I was glad to be in Paris. It was the best thing that could have happened. I'm from Berlin, so I knew about big cities, but Paris was in a different league. I could live here without my life being in danger.
The next step for the Wehrmacht was to find accommodation. In a city vacated by 2/3 of its inhabitants, conditions were ideal. The grand hotels were empty, as were most of the apartments. To avoid fighting, Paris was declared an open city. This meant that the French authorities had to bow to the demands of the victors, effectively giving the Germans carte blanche.
The best guide was the Michelin Guide, which had been translated into German, the 1939 Red Michelin Guide. The best areas, the best hotels. The occupier could choose the most pleasant spots. It's symbolic. Obviously, they wouldn't choose to live in some grim-looking building.
The requisitioned hotels were all very grand. Starting with the Hotel Meurice, Rue de Rivoli, headquarters of General Schomberg, the new master of Paris. The city's most prestigious hotel, the Ritz in Place Vendôme, was reserved for the high dignitaries visiting Paris. Marshal Hermann Göring, head of the Air Force, had a suite reserved all year round. This was where he held his most lavish, sumptuous parties. On the left bank, the Lutetia, most modern of all Parisian five-star hotels, became the headquarters of the Abwehr, the German Secret Service. And biggest of all was the Majestic. This hotel was home to the MBF, or Military High Command for the whole of France. It was headed by General Otto von Stülpnagel.
And symbols everywhere you turned. The Arc de Triomphe first among them, Avenue Diana, all the names of Napoleon's victories. It was about revenge, too.
And to guarantee maximum security at these highly sensitive spots, the Nazi secret services obtained the exact plans.
You could buy land registry plans. The plans always showed the entrances and exits. So in case of attack, there was always the possibility of escape. So obviously the requisitions were made with escape scenarios in mind. The more important the place, the more exits it had.
Officers did not complain about their accommodation. The Georges V, the Raphael, the Crillon, and the Royal Monceau were just some of their sumptuous billets. And it wasn't just a matter of comfort.
Every room had a telephone. Not only could we house everyone, we also had the infrastructure. What we required was electricity and control of the telephone exchanges. As hotels only have beds, we then required desks, lamps, and typewriters. So the Germans drew up long lists of demands that the French people had to meet.
How did this work? Let's take the example of the Majestic, with its 200 rooms and luxury suites. On the first floor, room 119 became the office of a lieutenant who managed the soldiers' leave. Next door, former bedroom number 118 was turned into a secretarial office, with 117 the registration room for newly arrived soldiers. On the fourth floor, former Suite 464 became the office of Dr. Michel, in charge of governing the economy of German-occupied France. The highest military authorities report here. Decoration was simple and Spartan, just the one portrait of Hitler. Such was military discipline. In all, the German requisitioned 400 hotels in Paris. The hotel owners had no complaints. The German occupier paid its bills, but with French money. It was left to France to pay the expenses of the German occupation. 400 million francs, around 160 million euros every day.
We set up a bank account into which the French state would pay 400 million francs every day. The Germans used the money in this account to finance the occupation, the hotels as well as deliveries to the Reich. Germany was paying its bills, but with French money.
To satisfy their requirements, the Germans seize apartments, whole buildings even. The prestigious British bank Lloyd's of London became La Caisse de Crédit du Reich. Then there were the apartments of Parisian Jews who had fled the Nazis. No rent was required there, of course.
No Jews, Freemasons, Britishers, or Americans were allowed to own empty apartments anymore. So there was despoilment and requisitioning, seizures placed under seal. Jewish apartments, they were called. I'm talking, for instance, about Rothschild's mansions.
The Rothschild mansion on Avenue Foch became the headquarters of the Zippo SD, better known as the Gestapo, and the dreaded SS security squadrons. This was the armed wing of the Nazi Party, known for its ruthless cruelty to enemies of the Reich.
Each time this place was turned upside down and given a new purpose.
But the SS and the Gestapo were quietly finding their bearings. The real power lay with the Wehrmacht, the German army, for the time being. To the requisitioned hotels and buildings were added two hospitals, La Riboisière and La Pitié-Salpêtrière, a dental clinic in the 13th arrondissement, as well as barracks on the outskirts of the city and three in the center, Prince Eugène, École Militaire, and even the Polytechnique. This is where the soldiers were billeted, in conditions that were much more basic.
Certain arrondissements were privileged, of course. The east of Paris was seen as the red area, the communist neighborhoods. In the 10th, 11th, 19th, and 20th, there was little German presence.
The occupying forces decreed a curfew. Nobody was allowed on the streets after 11 o'clock at night, and windows had to be blacked out. At night, the Germans wanted the city to be deserted and invisible. The gates to the capital were placed under surveillance. Between tanks and roadblocks, everyone had to show their credentials to enter Paris, both the French and the soldiers of the Reich. The Ausweis was a pass that was valid from several hours to several months. These were obtained from the Kommandantur, Place de l'Opéra.
The Kommandantur was the equivalent of the town hall. It settled all the administrative details of everyday life and issued all the papers that required authorization by the Germans. But it also functioned as an information center for German soldiers.
And to really make sure that Paris became German, a profusion of signs and indications sprang from the major intersections in the capital to direct the troops to strategic spots such as hospitals, barracks, and command centers. During the summer of 1940, Paris was turned into a German city.
Eine Parade beschließt diese Stunde der Ehrung.
The new Lord's first show of force came with the victory parade at the foot of the Arc de Triomphe. 10,000 soldiers goose-stepped down on a deserted avenue.
The German units held their first parade not on the Champs-Élysées, as is often quoted, but down Avenue Foch. As you can see in the pictures, the Arc de Triomphe is at a slight angle. I reckon that was an attempt not to stir up French feeling.
Yet for these soldiers on the march past, the feeling of power was palpable. A young Austrian soldier recalls.
Crossing Paris, we felt like the kings of the world. That's quite natural for a soldier, I think. We were proud of having beaten the French so quickly.
But the best was yet to come. 10 days later, the old enemy surrendered.
Das Denkmal gallischen Hochmuts wird mit der Reichskriegsflagge bedeckt.
Hitler came in person. He demanded that the French surrender take place just as it did 22 years previously in 1918. The setting was the glade of the armistice near Compiègne, 30 miles north of Paris. And this carriage once resided in a museum. It was on this same table that representatives of France, Germany, and Great Britain signed the armistice on November 11th, 1918. The Führer's real triumph came days later when he paid a surprise visit to Paris at 6 o'clock in the morning. It would be his only visit to this city that had fascinated him since he was a boy.
He was at the Eiffel Tower, at the Trocadero, where that famous photo was taken. Then he went to the opera. There was even a concierge who had the keys and could show this delegation around. During this visit, Hitler noted that there had been changes to the plans he had studied as a youth. He knew the plans for the opera almost by heart. And the concierge indeed confirmed that the changes had been made. You could see how fascinated he really was by this city.
Later, Hitler entrusted it to his architect, Albert Speer.
I had always dreamed of visiting Paris. I often wondered whether Paris should have been destroyed. But when we've built the new Berlin, Paris will only be its pale shadow. So why destroy it?
Sag mir nie wieder, je t'aime, denn mir
Hitler shared this fascination for the City of Light with Joseph Goebbels, Nazi Minister for Propaganda. Goebbels saw Paris as a showcase city for the Reich, where life was good, as long as you were German.
In the eyes of Goebbels, Paris held a special place within the Reich. He soon saw the need to preserve the city's atmosphere and uniqueness. The Germans weren't interested in imposing typically German order in Paris, making it a second Berlin. As a showcase city, Paris should be an attraction for soldiers, a backdrop for adventure.
Paris grew to be the city of the warrior's rest, where he could forget the ordeal of the battlefield. The Germans had already won the war. But would they be able to win the hearts of the Parisians? Late summer 1940. The armistice had been signed and the war was well and truly over, at least in France. The Wehrmacht troops were becoming the occupying force. Life was gradually settling into a routine.
First, there were the permanent staff who work in the various administrations. There were between 20 and 25,000, and they didn't often change. Paris didn't need combat troops, but there was a contingent of soldiers that could be mobilized in case of trouble. Then there was the peripheral industry, developing weapons for the Germans, in particular tanks. And they needed soldiers for trials.
But the German army wasn't all about men. Young women of the Wehrmacht auxiliary force were arriving as reinforcement. They made up less than 10% of numbers, but participated in the war effort by freeing up men for the front. Many were secretaries or switchboard operators. Straight away, the French gave them a nickname, the Grey Mice, based on the color of their uniform. Their enlistment was not necessarily for ideological reasons.
The uniform was very chic. The suits were very elegant at the time. So the army would give these women a suit instead of paying them. Most of them came from modest backgrounds and thought that this uniform was something pretty special.
For them, the war was also an opportunity to escape the role of mother and housewife assigned by Nazi ideology. And they were discovering the jewel of Hitler's new empire, Paris.
When they were transferred to Germany or to Austria, they were rather disappointed because they wanted to go abroad. France, and more especially Paris, were among the favoured destinations, with the city of fashion and love a clear winner.
Among them was Gertrude, who came from a small village in the north of Germany. One of the lucky ones assigned to Paris, she was 20 at the time.
I had no clear idea of what to expect. I was just glad not to have ended up in a munitions factory. I was posted to the Northern Transport Kommandantur.
Gertrude arrived in August 1940 with a group of 30 girls who were billeted in a hotel a short stroll from the Madeleine. To her, everything in Paris was new.
We were in a big city, and most of us had never seen one before. We felt foreign and a little lost. We really had to tell ourselves that now we were in France, not Germany. At first, we couldn't leave the hotel alone. We'd be driven to work. We were a little scared. No one knew how the French would behave towards us.
How would the French react? That was headquarters' concern. Something to clear up before letting the soldiers roam free. That's what happened to Klaus. For the first month of his stay, he was confined to his Parisian barracks.
First, we had to settle into our barracks at the École Militaire, find our bearings, clean our uniforms. A soldier's daily routine is organized down to the last minute. They always find you things to do. You never get bored. But we couldn't go out right away.
Instructions came from the Führer in person in this note dated June 18, 1940. Soldiers must be an example of the German military spirit and show honesty, good humor, and virility in all situations. Roughly translated, Hitler was ordering each soldier to behave properly with Parisians. His objective was to make an ally of the enemy.
In 1940, the French people felt abandoned by their own government. And the Germans realized that their despair and anger against the French authorities was an opportunity to portray itself in a good light.
An agreement was signed at the highest level in October 1940, when Hitler met Marshal Pétain in Montreuil-sur-Loire. With his handshake, the old Verdun veteran officially promised that the Vichy government would collaborate with the next master of Europe. Whether they would win the hearts and minds of Parisians was another question. A veritable charm offensive began. Soldiers paraded every day on the Champs-Élysées, their impeccably polished boots keeping perfect order. Then this powerful symbolic gesture. They come to pay tribute on the tomb of the unknown soldier under the Arc de Triomphe. A coldly calculated tribute.
The Germans had the reputation of being barbarians, especially in France. So the barbarians arrived, but we saw that they didn't look like barbarians and didn't behave like barbarians. They weren't child eaters, it turned out, as we'd feared at first. They had the aura of victors. Everyone was fascinated by them, even the men. It's quite natural that the arrival of these men in their well-tailored uniforms with leather boots on their motorcycles was a real sensation.
On the steps of the opera and in the public gardens, military bands attempted to win over the Parisians, while National Socialist soup kitchens distributed free food to the needy.
You heard stories of small boys playing at war, who all wanted to be German soldiers because they were the winners.
Propaganda had done its job. So, from July 1940, Parisians returned from their exile. 19-year-old Jean-Claude returned to find new masters in charge of his city.
We came home to Paris, and I can still see the posters of a big German soldier carrying a child on his shoulders. It bore the legend, "Abandoned people, trust the German soldier." It was striking. We watched it with disbelief, not knowing what to do. We came back, and everything was calm.
The worst fears on both sides had faded. For the German soldiers, 1940 was a pleasure cruise. Klaus, the soldier from Berlin, finally obtained his first leave.
That's Paris.
Hier bis dahin bin ich hochgekommen.
That's me, on the first stage of the Eiffel Tower. We had climbed up to the first stage because the lifts had broken down. That was pretty high. The Pantheon, Notre Dame.
Klaus's memories are carefully catalogued in a luxury album supplied by the Army of the Reich. With its leather cover, helmet, swastika, and the inscription, "My Military Service." Thousands of servicemen carefully kept these travel journals. Armed with still cameras and film cameras, the German soldiers set off on guided tours, duly organized by the German High Command. At the Sacré-Cœur, Notre Dame, the Opera, the Louvre, Les Invalides, not forgetting the Trocadero and the Eiffel Tower, they basked in the glow of the City of Light, which now belonged to them. These guided tours would end, very symbolically, in the Hall of Mirrors in the Chateau of Versailles, where the infamous, for Germany, Treaty of Versailles had been signed in 1919. Revenge was perfect.
I don't call it tourism, as it trivializes the occupation. You can see the German soldiers striking a pose as the victors, the new masters. That was what Hitler and Goebbels wanted. Soldiers had to take photos as evidence of their glorious victories and send the photos home to tell their families of the merits of this war.
In this soldier's album, the photos and comments are unequivocal. These are the new masters, is the legend of this snap taken at the Chateau de Versailles. And this photo of the statue of a decapitated Louis XIV inspired another comment. Headless France.
It's ironic, of course, but the main idea is this. They are the new heads.
Or this officer's album, with its photo taken from the top of the Arc de Triomphe. The studied pose of a boot on a balustrade is that of the new master of Paris.
For the civilian population, photography was banned. At the same time, the soldiers would habitually confiscate all cameras, so the civilians had none. Photography was exclusive to Germans, and they took full advantage of it.
But the young Germans were curious about other things. Who were these Parisians?
It was a new world to me. But as I couldn't speak French, I couldn't talk to the French about it. So I remained silent. And so did the French, who couldn't speak a word of German.
The young operator Gertrude tried her hand with the little French she learned at school. She began with the concierge and the maids in her hotel.
I always made an effort to speak to them. They were fairly reserved, though. They had their national pride.
How could they like me? We had beaten them. The French accepted their fate, and I accepted mine. We each lived according to that principle.
We tried to act as if we didn't see them. There'd be times in the street we'd see a detachment going from one point to another, and we'd pointedly turn our backs and look in the shop windows.
By leaving her hotel, Gertrude discovered another world, a different way of life and a different way of thinking.
The French are rather superficial. They don't take life seriously, like the Germans do.
To the Germans, the French were superficial, distant, and ill-mannered. And Parisian women were the devil incarnate. In a letter to his wife, soldier Ernst took offense at their look.
You wouldn't believe your eyes if you saw the lousy makeup with which women smear their faces. If my wife did such a thing, I'd pack my bags and leave without delay. It's incredible. I have to think of something else, or I'd be seized by violent nausea. These bright red lips, these yellow-painted faces, these black-etched eyebrows and dazzling nail varnish. Filth lurks beneath all the flashiness.
For the Germans, it was a culture shock. The Parisian women were so different from the German feminine ideal extolled by Reich propaganda. Concerned with the behavior of its troops, the Wehrmacht even devoted an entire chapter to French women in its official guide, Paris Seen by the Germans.
The Parisienne is flirtatious, but in spite of her natural tendency to use her womanly wiles, she has a strong sense of family and loves her children dearly.
We wanted to avoid misunderstandings by explaining to the soldiers that there were other customs in France. A French woman is not a prostitute or an easy woman just because she looks the way a prostitute looks in Germany.
But some soldiers did try their luck.
Some sought physical contact, obviously. They'd open with, "Fancy a stroll, mademoiselle?" And sometimes it worked.
However, headquarters frowned upon any contact between its troops and civilians. The soldiers were given very strict instructions. Avoid all contact with the civilian population. French women must not be given a ride in an official car or held by the arm.
The big problem was soldiers who get too close to the civilian population end up forgetting their duty as soldiers.
Paris was nicknamed the city without eyes. The Germans would look at the French women, who would ignore them. But in the long run, that becomes unbearable.
Divided by war, divided by language, divided by culture. How could the new lords and masters live with those they defeated in the 1,000-year Reich promised by Hitler? But the many assets of Paris threatened to lead any invaders astray. Late summer 1940, German soldiers had taken over the heart of Paris, its best terraces and cafes. More than this, they were also taking the stores by storm. At the start of the occupation, Paris was like the cave of Ali Baba.
The Germans had shopping fever. They wanted to buy the things they didn't have back home, as all tourists do. They bought everything they could. The French said, even when they brought out fashions from 70 years ago, they bought them anyway.
From the moment you're no longer at war, but in a situation of occupation, the commercial relationship is a conventional one. If a soldier took from a store without paying, that was theft, severely punished by the military tribunal.
For the first time in their lives, the soldiers had spending power. Their 90 Reichsmark pay packet was the equivalent of the minimum wage today. Yet with a new exchange rate that favored the occupiers, its spending power was multiplied by 4. And that was just pocket money. For the soldiers' board and lodging was paid for by France. That was when they discovered the joys of shopping.
I bought perfume. Soir de Paris. Everyone bought that at the time. It came in a blue bottle with stars on it. I don't honestly recall if it smelled good, but it was a pretty bottle.
There was no such thing as a soldier who didn't, at least once, send silk stockings by mail to his girlfriend. It was sheer luxury.
We had to discover the big stores. The Trois Quartiers, the Galerie Lafayette. It was a real adventure for us. We had no big department stores like that. We were used to the village grocer. We were glad to discover exotic fruit from distant countries. None of us had ever eaten a banana.
For the officers who received double pay, it was even better. Such terms meant a few extras could be afforded. Extras in the luxury bracket. It was the case for this officer, Heinz Lorenz. For 4 years, his one obsession was to spoil his son Peter back home.
I had the best skis in the world. A wonderful French bicycle you couldn't find in Germany. He bought it all in Paris. My father would also bring back luxury perfumes, fine vintages from Burgundy and Bordeaux. My father certainly had class. In Paris, he was wallowing in luxury.
But the Germans didn't just set their sights on luxury items. Surprisingly enough, they bought food to send back home to the triumphant Reich.
They even sent half pigs or fresh eggs wrapped in padded boxes. The soldier wanted to fulfill his role as breadwinner and help his family, left to manage on their own. While far from home, all he could do was contribute to the household and send back as much as he could. At the same time, this was part of the Reich's strategy. The more soldiers sent back items bought at low prices in occupied countries, the fewer shortages existed in Germany.
France was a storehouse for Germany in a war that was dragging on with no end in sight in 1940. So the aim was to exploit all of this country's resources to continue the war against Britain.
Shipments became so numerous that the Reichspost was overwhelmed and decided to limit the weight of each soldier's parcel. The new masters embarked on a program of officially sanctioned plunder. 2/3 of French agricultural and industrial production was reserved for the occupying forces. This unequal division was provided for by the terms of the armistice. Parisians then entered a period of food as well as fuel shortages. Another form of looting went on more discreetly. Works of art were stolen from Jewish collectors in Paris and shipped to Goering and Hitler, great art lovers.
Goring came here to help himself more than 20 times, so there was obviously looting of French property going on, as they emptied all the apartments that once belonged to Jews, Freemasons, the Americans, the British, and sorted through their art. The finest pieces were put to one side, so this was organized, methodical looting.
Between 1941 and 1944, 29 convoys left Paris for the Reich. A total of 138 railway carriages filled with 4,170 crates. The biggest art heist in history. The Germans didn't know it yet, but the life of luxury that occupied Paris provided was soon to come to an end. June 22nd, 1941. Some 2,500 miles from Paris, Wehrmacht troops were invading the Soviet Union. Hitler had launched Operation Barbarossa. Once more, Eastern Europe was ablaze. It was a turning point in the war, but also for Paris. It saw the beginning of armed resistance. At Barbès metro station in Paris's 18th arrondissement, Alphonse Moser, midshipman in the German Navy, was shot to death by Pierre Georges, better known by his resistance codename of Colonel Fabien.
By late 1940, the population was waking up to the shock of defeat. High school and university students demonstrated on the Champs-Élysées against the occupation on Armistice Day. They were arrested in a joint French-German operation. These were the first signs that public opinion was shifting.
The students' peaceful demonstration triggered fierce repression. Whether a demonstration or an attack, any anti-German action was punishable by death. Sham trials were set up to hand down sentences. And if the culprits weren't found, the Wehrmacht would apply ruthless measures at Berlin's behest.
If a member of the Wehrmacht was killed, especially if it was a senior officer, there was an established quota that was generally around 100 hostages killed for one German.
The occupying forces made its sentences known on posters printed in both languages. Each time, they were death sentences. Their aim was quite simple: to spread terror.
You were fearful from the time you arrived at the metro station in the morning, and there were red posters indicating the number of people the Germans had executed. I remember well the poster announcing the execution of Destienne d'Orve.
The young captain of the French Navy was one of 100 hostages executed after the Barbès attack.
It was scary. You felt the grip of occupation. But it also meant that there were people fighting against the occupiers.
The Wehrmacht convinced the soldiers that behind each man, and especially behind each woman, an enemy of the Reich was hiding. But how could they go against human nature and prevent a whole army from having sexual contact?
I can tell you that a horde of young men with hormones on fire is dynamite. It's very dangerous, and it must be contained.
The solution was brothels reserved for members of the Wehrmacht, an initiative encouraged by Adolf Hitler.
If we expect a soldier to give his life unhesitatingly, then he must be allowed to love freely.
Dozens of brothels were then requisitioned. Both managers and prostitutes were French. Jewish women were forbidden. Any brothels for regular soldiers were in the poor neighborhoods. For the Reich, such frivolous fun was unthinkable.
What was forbidden in Berlin was permitted in France. I don't know if that is freedom, but I could enjoy something I didn't have at home. What am I talking about? Brothels.
In a letter to his wife, soldier Günther tells how brothels work, with a degree of caution.
My darling, I did not go. Those people really aren't to my taste, I must say. Statistics say that a whore turns on average 100 tricks a day. The record is 187. Imagine what a state they must be in. Hardly appetizing.
Then there were brothels reserved for officers, like Le Chabonnet, next to the Palais Royal, already a legendary institution during the Belle Époque, or the very famous and very modern 122 on Rue de Provence. Upscale bordellos with luxury interiors, oriental bathrooms, and furniture to fuel every fantasy. The women awaited the men in boudoirs with sultry decor. Whether dressed or not, they were all hand-picked. The Germans were obsessed with hygiene, because the real enemy of the Wehrmacht was venereal disease.
Paris had a reputation, rightly or wrongly, perhaps rightly, of being the city of pleasure, and also a reputation as a dirty city. Our ideas of health were not the same. The Germans found that the French did not wash every day. Hence the idea of the dangerous woman, the venal woman, and venereal disease.
At the time, syphilis was not a curable disease. So brothels like Le Chabonnet were equipped with a gynecologist's surgery where girls were checked twice a week. But that wasn't all. The soldiers too were examined and preventive treatments applied. The distributed lists featured the addresses of brothels on the left and on the right, those of the disinfection clinics soldiers had to attend both before and after having sex. In such an atmosphere, things could easily get out of hand. A disgruntled soldier related one punitive trip to a brothel.
We had to show them who was boss. We couldn't let that pass. We entered the brothel, fired off a few rounds, and went up to see the whore. We undressed her, threw her things out of the window, and beat her up. People just watched us. It was our revenge. We were at the height of our power.
Some soldiers sought a reign of terror. Austrian soldier Heinz recalls.
They ended up hating us, and it was all our fault. We were arrogant. When we were on patrol, we'd check whether people were respecting the curfew and if the curtains were properly drawn. If we saw a light, the officers would fire at the windows. Because of that kind of thing, people ended up really hating us.
The challenge for the chiefs of staff was to avoid blunders at all costs. In Paris, the occupier recreated Germany in the most prestigious neighborhoods. There were 2 German bookstores, one on Rue de Rivoli and the other on the Champs-Élysées. 3 cinemas were also requisitioned, 2 on the Champs-Élysées and the Rex, with its huge 2,000-seat auditorium. On the program were German films, ranging from romantic comedies and musicals to downright propaganda.
The most important thing was they had to rebuild part of Germany to give these soldiers their haven of peace. The big challenge was to keep them occupied and contain them. For example, they needed to celebrate Christmas in a German way, to live as if they were back at home. It was very important.
In addition, Paris had 6 soldiers' hostels. The largest were found at Place de Clichy, Saint-Michel, and the Champs-Élysées. As the portrait of the Führer looked on, German food was served. Carrot soup, fried fish with salad and potatoes. All in a typically German atmosphere.
They enjoyed getting together and the German way of life. The Kaffeekuchen, a place where you can drink coffee and eat cakes, read German papers, buy German books. It was all well thought out.
You'd still find food in those places. There was nothing in the Parisian brasseries. The menu was tiny, whereas there, you had a choice.
And in the luxurious aviators hostel on Boulevard de Courcelles, there was even a faithfully reproduced Bavarian brasserie, enough to take away the homesickness. In soldier Kurt's letters to his fiancée, Dorit, we read,
The coffee and cakes were really good and the dinner wasn't bad either. Then we enjoyed playing a little table tennis. When I saw the little French waitress, I thought it was you. Right away, I felt very lonely. I longed to be with you.
Then there was the Madeleine Soldiers Café, close by the church. It was the most luxurious and the most popular, too. The Wehrmacht head of leisure was Heinz Lorenz, the officer who sent the latest in French bikes to his son in Germany. In his memoirs, he described the atmosphere of these places.
They stormed the cafe. It was scary. All they wanted was to eat some cake and forget the war for a while. The soldiers were obsessed with sweet things. What we served was hardly haute cuisine. Poor quality flour, a little milk, and lots of sugar. The main things were the decoration and the waitress's smiles. In just one weekend, we sold 22,000 of these cakes.
The tireless officer Lorenz went to great lengths to provide soldiers with all manner of distractions.
He organized sports tournaments, mini Olympics, athletics competitions, races, high jumps, the whole athletics program.
I did a lot of sport, especially swimming. We had a swimming pool reserved for us, where I often went. I even passed my lifesaver certificate.
Then there was football, the national sport in Germany. The Wehrmacht held a championship where teams from the Luftwaffe and the armored panzer divisions would fight it out. Each time the Parc des Princes was full, and it was always the Germans who won. Heinz Lorenz even sought out artists from among the soldiers for painting and drawing contests. These odd uniformed painters would then set up their easels in the most picturesque and romantic spots in Paris, like Montmartre. And the results were sometimes surprising. Like these little drawings by soldier Private Schmitz, which depicted some of the German soldiers' more risque fantasies. It's doubtful whether the Führer would have approved.
He wanted to keep the soldiers busy, to allow them to make the most of their time. That's why he organized these painting competitions. And among the soldiers, there were real artists.
And his father didn't lack for imagination. He even had an old barge restored to offer soldiers cruises along the Seine. Every day, 200 of them would embark on the Touriste II, easily recognizable by a swastika. It was, in fact, the only civilian boat permitted to sail on the Seine. On the menu were oompa bands, romantic trips, and pretty hostesses. The boat trips were promoted in the German guides published in Paris. Most famous amongst them was De Deutsche Weggleiter, designed as a kind of timeout for the troops. Published every 2 weeks, it was kind of a Swiss army knife for the German soldiers in Paris. Map of the metro, the Parisian cultural program, the Wehrmacht's program, everything to help a soldier find his way in the big city, and more.
This guide also became very important to Parisian shopkeepers because they could include their advertisements. Photographic studios offered home portraits. Institutions like the Lido and other cabarets would advertise their programs, sometimes in color. Cinema, theatre, cultural life in general was quickly revived, and the Germans participated actively through this kind of guide.
In a few months, the Weggleiter went from 16 pages to more than 100. Parisian advertisers jostled for inclusion. Their ads, in German of course, promoting fashion shows, furs, furniture, baby supplies, and restaurants. In Montmartre, one of the Germans' favorite neighborhoods, the most famous restaurant was called La Mère Catherine, located on the Place de Théâtre. It was always full, and for good reason. The owner of this typically Parisian bistro had adapted his menu to German tastes.
French and German culinary tastes weren't the same. The Germans weren't keen on mollusks and seafood, whereas the French palate loved them. So at least that left something for the French to eat.
On the menu at La Mère Catherine, Strasbourg sausages, 6 francs. Surprisingly, some of the occupiers' eating habits would find their place in French gastronomy.
Grated carrots might seem rather strange, but it didn't exist before the Germans arrived. We began eating grated carrot in France, in occupied France, along with the occupier, and we carried on.
But the most daring soldiers actually tried French cuisine, which to them was totally exotic. Here's the letter of a soldier who decided to set off on a culinary adventure. The letter recounts his experiences to his wife.
My dear darling wife, I want to tell you something that will make you laugh a lot. Would you believe I actually tried snails? And I must say they were very good. I closed my eyes as I ate the first one. In taste and appearance, they're a little like kidneys. I could eat them every day.
Paris was the city of first times. One woman told me she had discovered hot chocolate. She had never drunk it before. They learned to drink champagne and other alcoholic drinks, even the absinthe that was drunk in bars.
Officers from headquarters, meanwhile, lived like lords. Exhibit 1. This menu served at a gala dinner at the opera. On the menu are oysters, vol au vent, filet of sole, brillat savarin, with boiled potatoes and chicken casserole with mushrooms and dauphine potatoes. And as a simple dessert, a baked Alaska. While the people of Paris were counting their ration tickets, the main restaurants favored by the Germans teemed with products unavailable to the common man. Chez Maxime's was the most prestigious dinner address in Paris, favorite haunt of Hermann Göring. Arnaud Breker, the Führer's favorite sculptor and a regular at Maxime's, would later write,
Maxime's was a celebration for the eyes and the palate, such as never existed after the occupation.
In 1941. While a party atmosphere reigned in Paris, in Eastern Europe the Nazis were beginning to round up the Jewish populations. It was the beginning of the final solution, the extermination of Europe's Jews. As in these terrifying images filmed in Latvia by the executioners themselves. The organizer of these massacres arrived in Paris in May 1942. He was Reinhard Heydrich, head of the SS security squadrons. Here, Heydrich is meeting René Bousquet to the left, head of the French police, which was charged with carrying out the dirty work.
The French thought, if we do these things ourselves, we retain a certain autonomy and a certain control of our country. And as we basically agree with all of this, the anti-Jewish persecution laws, there isn't really a problem.
The first step was the decree of June 7, 1942, which forced Parisian Jews to wear the yellow star. 83,000 stars were distributed in the police stations of Paris, 3 per person. In a cynical postscript, these had to be paid for by ration tickets. This action profoundly affected the Parisians.
I have a very clear memory of seeing an old gentleman who was wearing the Legion d'honneur, a lawyer in his lawyer's gown and the yellow star. I felt both surprised and moved. Moved to see this segregation for no real reason. They were forced to ride in the last carriage of the metro. And I remember I and others would also ride in that carriage to show a bit of solidarity with them. It was dangerous, because if there had been a roundup, we'd have been taken along with them.
July 1942. The Nazis announced their intention to deport 100,000 Jews from France. The French authorities complied. Carrying out the Veldiv roundup on July 16th, 13,152 men, women, and children were arrested and then deported to the death camps. Only 3% of them returned alive.
At that point, France had assumed the henchman's role in the German program for the final solution.
Between 1942 and 1944, 50,000 Parisian Jews were shot or deported to the death camps. These were the City of Light's darkest hours during the Nazi occupation. Autumn 1942. For 2 years, the Germans had been taking advantage of the good life offered by Paris. By now, Gertrude, the little Wehrmacht telephone operator, had her list of favorite haunts.
I would find someone to talk to in the Luxembourg garden, The little children would be there, and it was always nice to speak to their mothers.
Looking for adventure, she went off to the heights of Montmartre. Intrigued by the artists, she plucked up her courage and started a conversation with one of them.
I started chatting with one of them. I wanted to know if he managed to live from his painting. In the end, he did a drawing of the Sacré-Cœur for me and even wrote my name on it.
But this idol was deceptive. The Parisian resistance was not sleeping. September 16, 1942. A first attack took place in front of the Hostel for Soldiers on the Champs-Élysées. A homemade bomb hidden at the metro entrance exploded too soon. It missed by a few minutes the soldiers who were due to leave the cinema next door. Just 24 hours later, another bomb went off in front of the Grand Rex as around 2,000 soldiers were emerging after a showing. That time, 4 were killed and 17 wounded. The German response was to shoot 250 hostages in retaliation. Heinz Lorenz, who was in the crowd, commented on these events in his memoirs.
I think the aim of the resistance was not particularly to kill German soldiers, more to divide the Germans and the French. That's what they succeeded in doing.
But such actions did have an effect on the German soldiers' everyday lives. They were forbidden to go out alone and had to carry a weapon at all times. The new watchword was vigilance.
We had to be careful, especially in the metro. Some places were dangerous. If we went too close to the edge of the platform, we could be pushed onto the rails.
Don't think that the soldiers were traumatized by the resistance. The Germans were the professionals. The Secret Service and the ZPO-SD were trained to flush out political opponents. And on the other side, you'd have, for instance, some teacher who decided to help the resistance and print a tract, but who was then powerless in the face of repression. So at first, the little resistance groups that formed found it very difficult. A whole network could be undermined by just a small amount of information.
Paris will always be Paris, and the resistance couldn't stop soldiers from having fun. The shows not to be missed are at the Lido, the Moulin Rouge, and the Folies Bergère, jam-packed every night. But more suited to German taste was Le Scheherazade, Rue de Liège in the 9th arrondissement. This show fascinated Private Lenz, who reported back to his wife in Vienna.
The variety show decor was a delight for the eyes, as were the scenery and props. Farces, songs, and women in various costumes, if one can call it that. One of the pieces put on especially for us was Vienna Waltzes, and they played the music of the Blue Danube. As you might imagine, despite my enthusiasm for the show, the tune made me slightly homesick.
The Parisian nightlife allowed the soldiers to enjoy what the Reich had labeled a degenerate art. Swing, the music of the American enemy, strictly forbidden in Germany. The soldiers were also crazy about Django Reinhardt and the gypsy orchestras, just as the Reich was deporting thousands of Romani people to the concentration camps.
The Germans loved this kind of show. Sometimes real fights broke out between soldiers and the French public for the best seats in the house.
French stars like Maurice Chevalier, Miss Denguette, Fernandel, Arletty, and Sacha Guitry would perform for the occupying forces and thus become darlings of the German public.
Paris wasn't a military target. It really was an exceptional situation here, and your leave could be far more pleasant than back home in Germany.
Thousands of miles from Paris, the fighting continued. The front needed men, and Klaus, the soldier from Berlin, joined Rommel's Africa Corps in Tunisia. But other soldiers came here straight from the battlefield. Paris was the ultimate reward for their sacrifices. One of them was called Gisbert Witte. This signalman in the Air Force, age 22, had always suffered from kidney trouble. Gravely ill, Gisbert was sent to Paris to convalesce. This meant escaping from the battlefield for a few weeks, and he was determined to make the most of it.
The first thing my father did when he arrived at a new posting was to find out the cultural program.
And there was no question of staying cooped up in a hospital. With 2 comrades in tow, Gisbert explored Paris. Their dream was to attend the opera. But only officers' uniforms or black tie and tails were admitted. So Gisbert and his chums hatched a plan.
The third in the gang was a waiter in the officers' mess. So he borrowed some tails from the officers' mess. They'd identified the right sizes. And they went out. They spent a few nice evenings like that. My father later said, God knows what they'd have done if we'd been caught. But they did that several times.
At the opera, Opera Comique, or Salle Pleyel, quotas of seats were reserved for the troops. And the commandant of Paris had his own box.
In the cloakroom at the Théâtre Hébertot, there was row upon row of German officers' hats. I was amazed, thinking this wasn't a naked girls' show. This really was an intellectual show. So many Germans spoke French so well that they were interested in French intellectual life, I imagine.
But the Germans also wanted to show the Parisians that they were from a nation of great culture. They brought in the best the Reich could muster. The Berlin Philharmonic, conducted by Herbert von Karajan. That was at the Theatre de Chaillot, requisitioned 3 times a week for German programming. On a more modest scale, Gertrude also tried to bring people together with the Wehrmacht Protestant Choir. At Christmas, in 1942, she sang Bach's Passion at Notre Dame. At the same time, bombs were falling on Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich.
When I went back to Germany on leave and talked about my adventures with the choir and our concert in Notre Dame, my father replied, "You really do live as if in peacetime. The war doesn't affect you."
In Paris, soldiers were spared the war. Opera lover Gisbert, therefore, did everything to avoid returning to the battlefields.
He knew that once his treatment was over, he'd be forced to return to the Russian front. So he and one of his friends, who had some medical knowledge, made a mixture of blood and urine to convince the doctors he was seriously ill. This meant he wasn't sent back to the front. He always told us children that it had saved his life. For not one man from his unit returned from Russia alive.
Paris was still the troops' favorite R&R destination. But for how much longer?
брехуны звонили на весь мир.
1943 marked a turning point. German soldiers were dropping like flies in Stalingrad, where hundreds of thousands were taken prisoner. For the first time, the Parisians could feel a wind of change. But the press was controlled by the Germans, and newspapers only reported glorious successes. So Parisians went looking for the news on the BBC.
We'd tune into Radio London. We never turned it up in case someone heard us. It had been known for Germans to enter the house and immediately check the radio to see what you'd been listening to. If it was Radio London, people would find themselves in trouble.
The French discreetly rebelled against the occupiers, as these collaboration posters showed. With a few judicious snips, fight against Bolshevism could become fight against the Jerrys. Parisians singled out metro posters for the same treatment.
Smoking was forbidden in the metro, so we put posters in each wagon. Rauchen verboten, no smoking. And the French had noticed that cutting a few letters gave race verte, green race. That meant the Germans all dressed in green.
And though the mood was tightening somewhat, the Germans had more than just enemies in France. In 3 years of presence of daily contact with civilians, some had become friends, and even lovers. Officer Heinz Lorenz stepped out with his prettiest Parisian conquests without batting an eyelid.
My parents had a very open relationship. My father was a real ladies' man. Neither would let a chance pass them by. They each lived their lives in parallel.
Love between French girls and German soldiers was unthinkable. And yet, from hate to indifference, from peaceful coexistence to friendship, and from sex to love, human nature worked its magic. Early April 1943, a young Breton girl of 24 arrived in Paris. Marguerite Rouxel had a big problem. She was carrying the child of Otto Amon, a German NCO in the Luftwaffe. She had come to Paris to give birth at the Port Royal Clinic. A special arrangement allowed women to give birth anonymously, under a false name. The fruit of this forbidden union was little Daniel, a love child.
My father really loved my mother. And my mother always loved my father, madly. Once my mother was at home, and I put a photo of my father on the television without her knowing. She happened upon it and, Otto, Otto. She sounded like a young girl finding her lover. And she wept. It was a real love story.
Otto and Mathilde's love story began in Brittany, on the roads around Saint-Malo, where they met for the first time.
She'd gone for a spin on her bike on the Saint-Malo road. It must have been her day off, and she met my father, who was in a car with a comrade. They stopped the car and they chatted to my mother. A little detail about my father always amused me. He was eating cherries. My father was eating cherries, and he offered the cherries to my mother.
Mathilde found work as a canteen woman in the barracks where Otto worked. The lovers spent time together. Close friends on both sides knew, but looked the other way. The problems arrived when Daniel came into the world.
My father came up to Paris to see me, but he was stopped from coming in. He didn't have the right to enter the clinic.
The Germans didn't have the right to recognize these children. They couldn't marry French women. It was forbidden by the Wehrmacht.
Otto only saw his son and held him in his arms once.
He said to his mother, "I have a son in France. If I should die, I want him to be brought up like me."
But the war did its work, and Otto's unit had to leave France. At the age of 4, Daniel learned who his father was.
I went to school in September, and the kids came to see me. They didn't know me, but they all knew each other. "You're the son of a Jerry." What did that mean? "Yeah, your mother screwed a Jerry." All these absurd things, the rottenest things I'd ever heard. And all I wanted to do was cry, never to go back to school and just to cry.
Being a child of the enemy was a stigma that Daniel has borne all his life. Under pressure from friends and family, Otto and Matilda's love story became a nightmare for the mother and her son.
My mother was very embarrassed. I was an embarrassment for my mother. She was ashamed. There was always someone who would remind us. Always someone.
Even today, it is still very difficult to determine the exact number of children born of relationships between French women and German men. Estimations vary between 60,000 and 200,000. All stories of hidden love lived through a veil of shame. June 6, 1944 was D-Day, and the landings on the Normandy beaches. Americans, British, Canadians opened a western front to surround Hitler's Germany. In all, the Battle of Normandy would mobilize 3 million soldiers. The war had now come within 150 miles of Paris, and for the first time in 4 years, Gertrude was seeing the consequences. The operator became a nurse.
We had to treat them, dress their wounds, give them first aid, and quite a few were dying.
Yet in Paris, the German High Command behaved as if all was well. Instructions from Berlin were clear. Don't panic, inspire confidence in Parisians. But behind the scenes, people were busy.
At that moment, in early August 1944, the HQ was considering a retreat, but didn't yet envisage returning to Germany. Then they began systematically burning the files. The summer of '44 was described as very snowy, with the bits of falling ash.
Events were about to speed up. On August 19th, the first street fighting broke out. It was the start of the Parisians' insurrection, a total surprise to Gertrude. For the first time, she was scared.
We were no longer safe in the streets. There was shooting everywhere. It really was war.
The only possibility was to flee. Some, like Officer Lorenz, had already done that. Thanks to his Parisian friends, he found a driver to take him to Germany. But for the regular soldiers, nothing was planned, because for Hitler, defeat was never an option.
Germans had to be victorious because they were a superior race, for want of a better expression. Back then, a good soldier died in combat for his country, or was victorious.
The 20,000 soldiers were left to their own devices. Their options were few. In August 1944, trains were out of the question, sabotaged by the French resistance. Gertrude had only a few hours to find a solution.
Nobody was bothered about getting us out of Paris. My colleagues and I took the last metro to the terminus. There, we found a few German trucks already damaged by gunfire. One of them took us. We had to stop several times to hide on the way, and we were shot at. It was horrible. I don't know how we survived.
For Gertrude, the first stage was Verdun, then the Netherlands. For her, the war was not over. At the Hotel Meurice, the new commander of Paris, Dietrich von Choltitz, received an order from Berlin. Defend the city down to the last man, come what may. He mined strategic spots such as the telephone exchanges, the Senate, and the Alexander III Bridge. Everything was poised for Paris to become a battlefield. The thing was, most of the soldiers had left for the Normandy front.
The Germans were trying to muster makeshift units at the last minute. That's when we realized that among the 20,000 soldiers still in Paris, very few had any military training. They were mostly functionaries in uniform, but not soldiers.
August 23rd. General Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division was only 30 miles from Paris, and nothing could stop it. Von Choltitz knew that defending Paris was a waste of time. He even negotiated a ceasefire with the resistance. News from abroad had not reached Berlin. So Hitler dashed off a telegram with this now famous question: is Paris burning?
It wasn't a destruction order. Von Choltitz set out the truth in his memoirs after the war because he thought it was what the French wanted to hear. He wasn't interested in informing Berlin that he had negotiated an armistice with the resistance, because it may have been seen as high treason.
He behaved as a soldier rather than a Nazi, thinking it was better to preserve Paris and his troops rather than fighting to the death in what could only be a defeat.
On August 24th, around 6 o'clock in the evening, the first of General Leclerc's French tanks arrived in Paris in front of the Hôtel de Ville, already captured by the resistance.
All of a sudden, we heard the church bells peal out. That day, the radio had passed into the hands of the resistance, and the announcer was repeating a call to the priests of Paris to ring their church bells for the liberation of the capital. It was all happening right at that moment. So we gradually heard the church bells begin to ring. It was very moving.
But the next day, August 25th, 1944, the fighting raged, with the most violent clashes around German strategic points: the Kommandantur, the Majestic, and the École Militaire. More than 1,000 Frenchmen and 3,200 Germans lost their lives. One after the other, the German fortresses fell. The Meurice was one of the first. It was here that von Choltitz signed the surrender, at precisely 2:45 p.m.
Then there was the issuing of new orders by the German officers, accompanied by French or Allied soldiers, at the various pockets of German resistance.
Paris was liberated. Pictures of these jubilant scenes found their way around the world. Not forgetting the snaps of the fallen former German masters, almost 13,000 of them were taken prisoner. For the Parisians, the role reversal held symbolic importance.
The victorious German army that had paraded from Concorde up the Champs-Élysées was now a defeated force. Yesterday's victors had become today's vanquished.
Parisians hadn't forgotten the occupation, the shortages, the roundups, and the repression. Seeing the former occupying force as a defeated triggered a sense of relief that sometimes spilled over.
There were scenes with soldiers who were insulted, roughed up somewhat, spat upon. So there was moderate violence, verbal and physical violence, a letting off of steam. That was the civilian population, and in fact it wasn't particularly the men. The women and children took their revenge for the occupation by the victor, who was now beaten and defenseless.
For these soldiers, the war was now over. The occupying force had become prisoners. The PG on their uniforms reflected their change in status to prisoner of war. The 800,000 German prisoners of war in France would be requisitioned to demine the beaches and work in the northern coal fields. The last among them returned home in 1948. Gertrude arrived in Germany safe and sound. She returned to her home region, married, and had 3 children. She now lives in a retirement home in the north of Germany. Klaus, the volunteer soldier, spent 4 years in captivity in the United States. He returned in 1948 after 8 years' absence. Today, he lives in Berlin. Private Gisbert returned to Germany. He opened an electrical appliance store in Cloppenburg. Music remained his passion. Since his death in 2014, his daughter preciously guards his souvenir photos of Paris. Officer Heinz Lorenz went back to his son. Right up until his death in 1966, he continued to organize cultural events, such as the German Wine Festival. As for Daniel Ruxel, child of a Jerry, he met his German family at the age of 12. In 2009, after years of administrative hassle, he obtained dual German nationality. His name is now Daniel Ruxel Amon. In Paris, there are no reminders of the dark years of the occupation. Fascination for the city of light is as strong as ever.